The White House says they see a path forward on infrastructure despite negotiations that appear to be going nowhere.
Meanwhile, former President Donald Trump is praising Senator Joe Manchin for his apparent flip-flop on the filibuster. Team Rising is here to weigh in. Democratic strategist and owner of JC Strategies, Jennifer Holdsworth-Karp, is here along with Rachel Bovard of the Conservative Partnership Institute. Welcome to both of you.
Good morning.
Good morning.
All right, let's start with you, Rachel. What do you think of Trump praising Manchin? Is this good or bad news for Manchin, who has a pretty low approval rating in his own state right now? He's not up for re-election for a good bit of time, but at the end of the day, getting the support of Donald Trump, a good or a bad thing for Joe Manchin?
I think ultimately it's indecisive for Manchin, but I do think, it puts a target on his back. He has made some enemies of progressives with his stand on the filibuster. And I think a Trump endorsement or even a Trump head pat is never a good thing in that regard. So ultimately, I think it's a wash. But in the short term, Joe Manchin's got to look over his shoulder a little bit.
I think we actually have a clip of Trump and Manchin that we can play right now.
Mr. President, Senator Manchin says he will not end the filibuster. That seems like a victory for the Republicans, because it's going to make it very difficult for the Democrats to push through a far left agenda, certainly through the Senate. Do you read it that way?
Well, it's a very important thing. He's doing the right thing, and it's a very important thing. Otherwise, you're going to be packing the court. You're going to be doing all sorts of very, very bad things that were unthinkable and were never even brought up during the election.
Right. And so there you have Trump, who's never been one for consistency, taking an opposite position of the one he took before. But nothing remotely surprising about that. I mean, Trump is very utilitarian in whatever position he takes at the moment and has never claimed to be anything else. Rachel, I kind of feel like Trump praising Manchin is something that Manchin considers nothing but a good thing back at home. Do you think, though, it puts him under extra pressure in the Senate among his own colleagues? Is that why you think it's indecisive?
I do, think he's facing a lot of pressure internally. And I think you're seeing progressives chomp at the bit a little bit to come out and say what they really think about his position. And you're seeing some of them not be shy about it. But ultimately, my read on Joe Manchin has always been that he takes these positions, but has a hard time seeing them through. So, I look at his commitment to preserve the filibuster as maybe half true. I think if pressure becomes immense, he'll find an out, whether it is, a niche opening for removing the filibuster when it comes to voting bills, or, reducing the threshold, keeping the filibuster in place, but reducing it from 60 votes to 55 or something like that. I don't see Joe Manchin as the bulwark that's going to really stand between his party and something of this magnitude. Happy to be proven wrong, but in years of observing Joe Manchin, I haven't really seen that kind of fortitude.
Jennifer, is Manchin clumsy or brilliant in these negotiations and when it comes to commenting things on the filibuster? Has he been playing this brilliantly, or has he just been playing this clumsily from the perspective of a Democrat?
The answer is yes. I think that he's actually playing both sides of the coin here, and I actually completely agree with Rachel. Up until this year, he has never been the deciding vote on a major Democratic initiative one way or the other. If he votes against it, it's usually because he's been given a pass to do so. This is the first year that he's really out there in the way that he wants to be. So I think he's still feeling that position out in the Democratic Party and in the caucus right now. Our majority is, to say the absolute least, right? So I just happen to think that he's quote unquote moderate on all the wrong things, right? This is not the place to come out and sort of show your independence. Having that pat on the head from Trump, I actually think is detrimental to him. I think that he wants this to be, even though it's not, sort of above partisanship. And that's not exactly how it's playing out for him. I don't think that he's headed down the right road with this particular decision, which is why I think you will see him come back around on this. Maybe not on others, but on the filibuster specifically, he has definite ideas on how it should be reformed. He's going to keep harping on those.
I mean, to Jennifer's point about this being an odd hill for him to die on, an odd place to pick the fight, we have some polling from Data for Progress that talks about both the popularity of the For the People Act, of the American Jobs Plan, the American Families Plan. This is basically the Biden agenda is actually polls extraordinarily well in West Virginia. And there's no support for the idea that we should not pass this popular agenda because the Rule 22 is important and we ought not to reform the filibuster. That's just not a thing that exists among real people out in the wild. If something is popular, people believe that then it ought to be enacted into law. Rachel, does this matter, or is Washington so divorced now from public opinion that Manchin is able to just disregard what people back in West Virginia think?
Well, I think so much of how people perceive these things depends on context as well, because again, I've said this before on this show, but nuking the filibuster or changing the filibuster, in my mind, is inherently a position of laziness. And the Senate, as we know, is the laziest institution in the United States. But in so many of these cases, these bills can be brought to the floor, and Republicans in many cases can be forced to stand there and block incredibly popular legislation. Democrats just don't make them do that. And of course, the tables would turn if Republicans were in charge. Republicans don't do the same thing. They sort of fall in the face of a filibuster threat and never actually do the work. So I think that, Democrats, if they want to make this case, bring these bills to the floor, force Republicans to stand there and oppose them, but also, open an amendment process, attempt some compromise, because I do think that is also, people, that resonates with people when you're actually trying to work through a process. But ultimately, I don't think the filibuster itself should be enough to tank these bills. Put the bills on the floor, have a process, and see what comes at the end of it. People try to bake the end before you've actually even tried, and that, I think, is a failure of politics.
Jennifer, I want to get you to respond to this Jamel Hill tweet that we can put up on the screen here. All right, this is so on brand for this country. Record number of black voters show up to save this democracy, only for white supremacy to be upheld by a cowardly, power-hungry white dude. Senator Joe Manchin is a clown. Now, we actually know that Manchin is now going to have to answer to a lot of black activists in the Democratic Party for this, because he's having conversations with them, I believe, today. And this is going to be an ongoing issue for him. How much do you think the race dynamic in the context of this conversation, as we're seeing particularly that sort of level of offense against Joe Manchin, how much do you think that hurts him in this ongoing conversation about the filibuster and about H.R. 1?
So let me be clear. As a white woman, I don't get to decide what is racist. I don't get to decide what actually feels racist. But I caution folks to use hyperbole in this conversation. I believe it was Al Sharpton who said at the very beginning of this conversation, if we come at Manchin with an argument of race, it's going to diminish the real problems with his voting record on the things that we want passed. So I think this is going to be a huge problem for him in pundit conversation on Twitter. Around the country and in West Virginia, it's just not. A question was asked before, is Washington that divorced from public opinion? The plain answer is yes. But I think that we also need to acknowledge some of the real problems with this bill. Even the ACLU cautioned extreme warning about H.R. 1 and certain things that were in there that could be poison pills if progressives and other folks in the Democratic Party actually took a look at it, instead of being just obstinate and saying, this is our goal, this is what we're doing, we're passing it no matter what, and if you're not on board, you're an abject racist, right? There's a couple of disclosure provisions in this bill that would require people who are giving paid speeches on certain issues to disclose that. What if you were giving a speech about reproductive rights or something that's a progressive priority, right? That's a very chilling effect that this bill has. It would also require all different disclosure, reporting, and prohibitions on FARA, which, by the way, is an excellent priority to have in this bill. But it would have an unintended effect of having folks like undocumented immigrants, dreamers, those with TPS from being able to advocate for their own causes. There are so many problems with this bill that I agree with Rachel. We should be going back and we should be looking at it and negotiating and see if we can come to a consensus that works for everyone. I do believe that the folks that are saying that there's racist undertones here, or by the way, just overtly racist, probably have a point. I think that we need to be careful in how we discuss it.
And Jennifer, I want to get your reaction to one thing in responding to Rachel. She had said that what Democrats could do is just kind of force Republicans to go to the Senate floor. And in general, the way that they now call this a silent filibuster, because all that a senator has to do is go to the floor and say, I object to moving forward. I object to this motion to proceed to debate, or I object to this motion to move to a final debate. And all they have to do is object. And then the majority has to file what's called a cloture motion. That cloture motion needs 60 votes. So it could be 59-0, and it still fails. So Republicans don't actually, and the minority doesn't actually have to take the floor, except under this one kind of arcane scenario that I've seen thrown out. And Jennifer, I'd like to get your take on this. The idea is that there is a rule in the Senate that senators can only speak twice a day. And day is not 24 hours, because this is the United States Senate. They define time. They are the most powerful institution in the world. And so they define a legislative day as whatever they say it is. So if you say, okay, the legislative day begins today and it extends until the time that we're finished debating this bill. So if a senator comes to the floor and says, I object, and then they walk away, boom, you've spoken once. So if you have 50 senators who were in the minority, 100 of them, that's 100 speeches that they could give. And at that point, you could make a motion that says there is no more debate because everybody has spoken. And so I move to move to a final vote. There's some argument that would be a plausible way of forcing people to stand and actually fight against something. It feels a little crazy to me that they would actually try to pull this off. Jennifer, have you heard any talk about trying to actually make them talk? And is this conceivable?
It is conceivable. I have heard of nobody who is willing to do that. I have not heard anything coming out of the majority leader's office that would indicate that was part of the plan in any way. It's exceedingly frustrating how actually weak Democrats are when we are in power. It's something that I've spoken out on the show. It's something that I've spoken out on in various other places. We need to take the bull by the horns and just get it done. Get in the mess, show the American people how the procedure that you described, how it works, and how Republicans are holding us hostage on getting what we need done. On the other hand, let's not pretend that Joe Biden was elected with some massive mandate. It was a decisive win. We absolutely had the support across the country for the things that he was talking about, but it was more a conversation about a return to normal, rescuing democracy, making sure that we were done with the Trump era for now. But what it really has come to is whether or not we're going to use the majority that we were given to pass some of these priorities. You can have policy problems with these priorities. You can have your say on how we're actually constructing and crafting these bills. But unless we utilize some of the procedures like the one that you just described, I do fear that we're going to lose the majority because we did not accomplish what we set out to do.
Right. At least it would look like they were fighting. But stick with us. We'll be right back with more Team Rising.